As president of the International Security Forum, it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the 2020 International Security Forum Summit. ISF's inaugural event was held at Rutgers University, one of 9 colonial colleges established before the American Revolution. Today, we're meeting virtually in the face of a worldwide pandemic and global unpredictability to discuss matters at the nexus of leadership and defense policy. ISF 2020 is a convergence of governmental, nonprofit, and academic leaders examining the world's most pressing strategic challenges, ranging from military capability development in Europe to nuclear policy worldwide. Should you have any questions about today's that you'd like to ask today's speakers, please feel free to send them to questions at isf2020.info, and we'll do our best to bring them into the conversation. I would now like to turn the floor over to the distinguished professor of law and global affairs at Rutgers University, Dr. Jean-Marc Lacroix.
Yes, sorry, yes. No, yes, good afternoon here in the US, and I believe, Edmund, that the event is also taking place in Poland, so good afternoon also in Poland. And thank you, Edmund, for this introduction. So as Edmund mentioned, I am Jean-Marc Coicot. I teach law and international politics at Rutgers University. And I have been asked by Edmund to say a few words of introduction for this online event. I'm happy to do so. And since the theme is global security and geostrategy perspective and challenges, I have been thinking that I will simply limit myself to sharing with you a few thoughts on the situation in which we currently find ourselves, in particular in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, from the standpoints of domestic and international relations. I will speak just for a few minutes, and I would like to do so by trying to identify a few lessons arising out of what has happened in the past months since the COVID crisis has started. And among these lessons, in my view, 4 stand out. First, there are winners and losers in the context of this crisis. Second, there is, I think, a high price to pay both domestically and internationally in not working together in order to address a crisis of really global proportion. Third lesson, in times of crisis, the problems that have accumulated over the years do not get better. In fact, they get worse and show how self-destructive it can be for us to have ignored them all along. And the fourth lesson, turning to the future, is that there is an urgent need to get our head out of the sand, so to speak, stop being in denial about the multiple crises that confront us and at home and abroad, and try to do something about them. So let me review quickly each of these 4 lessons, since Edmund has given me 10 minutes. First, the winners and losers. Clearly, there are countries that have managed the COVID crisis much better than others. Interestingly, they tend to be in Asia. They are Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore in particular, and to some extent Japan, despite being geographically close, very close to China, where the crisis has originated. They have managed to have relatively few infections and deaths because of COVID, and this is really an achievement. And it seems to me that what has been key to their success has been the approach of systematic prevention on the part of the authorities and of rather systematic discipline on the part of the people, including in terms of mask wearing, social distancing, and contact tracing. And the fact that these countries have strong traditions of public policy, including as applied to healthcare, as of mask wearing. I used to live in Japan for a number of years, and I was always impressed by how disciplined Japanese people are in terms of wearing a mask when they have the flu or when they have a cold. And of course, this is something which has been the case across the region. When you go to Korea, when you go to Hong Kong, when you go to Singapore, that's the case. And I think that this kind of mask wearing culture, if you will, prior to the crisis has been a key aspect for them to do well in the context of the crisis itself. As for the losers of the crisis, I would say that they are in particular Western countries. In the US, as in Europe, we have been unable to put in place all the way to today, in fact, coherent and systematic policies of prevention once we recognized that there was a problem. This has been the case in France, where I'm from, in the UK, just to mention two examples, but also in the US. And of course, as we all know, this is to the point that the crisis is still with us today and could be with us for quite a while. In France, they just started today a new partial lockdown because of the fact that the crisis is, COVID is coming back in a very strong fashion. So let me also add here that a few words on China. So because after COVID, in the context of the COVID crisis, China is in an ambiguous position. I do a lot of work with China. I also have a position in China, so I have an interest in the country. So on the one hand, in China, the situation, the COVID situation seems to be more or less under control. But on the other hand, the reputation of China has suffered because of COVID-19, because of course the COVID virus came from there, but it's also the case that China has been slow at somehow disseminating the information about the virus. And I think that this is certainly going to encourage the growing lack of trust that has taken place in the past years in the West toward China. So that's one lesson. The second lesson that we can draw from COVID-19 is that there is a high price to pay for not working together, be it at the domestic level or at the international level. At the international level, clearly, there has been a lack of coordination among governments. We haven't been able to come up with a globally coordinated response to address the pandemic. Each country has been more or less acting on its own as if it was possible to contain a global virus by conducting national policies. This has been the case in Europe, including at the European Union level, which has been a bit of a disaster. And at the domestic level, things have hardly been better, especially among the countries that have emerged as the losers of the crisis. And of course, sadly, from this perspective, the US is somewhat of a case in point. Here, it seems to me at least, authorities have reacted slowly and without ever putting in place coordinated policies at the national or federal, state and local levels. As a result, we are still in the midst of the crisis. And in this regard, in the US, I often hear people refusing to wear masks, saying that it is their right to do so. Of course, it is their right to do so, but in the process, I think that they tend to forget that rights are not a self-standing reality, if you will. Rights are through and through social. This is to say that it is the extent to which we show mutual responsibility toward one another that allows us to enjoy our rights. And short of this, it's quite difficult to think that our rights are secured. And so the sense of security that many people now feel about the sense of insecurity, rather, that many people now feel about the situation, and the sense of false security that reluctant mask-wearing people experience have much to do with this kind of situation. In other words, if we don't work together domestically and internationally, we will be in trouble. We're already in trouble. And we are all the more likely to be so as the problems, as the challenges are getting more and more global. The third lesson has to do with the fact that the problems we are now facing, the challenges we are now facing, are mainly, in my view, the product of years of neglect. This is the case both at the domestic level and at the international level. Focusing on the domestic level, I really believe that populism, for instance, is not the cause of or not the primary cause, at least, of the current problems we are facing. Populism is only, I think, a symptom. This is very much the case in Europe. This is very much the case in France, and I think that is also the case in the US. In a way, globalization has produced winners, but has also left a lot of people in the dust, so to speak. And these people who are also, the supporters of populism have been looked down upon, overlooked, and ignored by those who have benefited from globalization. And with populism, to some extent, these people are simply reminding those who have benefited from globalization that they exist and that they do not want to go down in a way quietly. And similarly, at the international level, the inability to give a global answer to the pandemic is echoing what has been what we could call a gridlock of international and global governance that has existed for quite some time now. At the global level, leaders meet and talk. I used to work for the UN. I used to be a speechwriter for the Secretary General, and I certainly saw these things firsthand. So leaders meet and talk, and yet the problems, the deep problems, are never really solved, and therefore they accumulate over the years, and they only get deeper. A fourth and final lesson, if you will, is the urgent need to get our head out of the sand and do something about the multiple crises we are facing, once again, domestically and internationally. In this regard, I think that it is not very surprising that crises at the domestic level are echoed by crises at the international level. How can things go right internationally if nationally, especially in leading countries, the situation is a bit of a mess? And in this regard, I do not see the political and administrative elite in Western developed countries having very much of a strategic approach about the future and the challenges we are facing. People in charge tend to be consumed by short-term and or if not self-serving concerns, and of course that's a major problem because the competition is ferocious, and the competition, especially coming from Asia, is moving forward, and in the meantime we are in a way sleeping at the wheel. So what I'm saying here is the following: we have to wake up, and more to the point, the people in charge have to wake up. But the question is, of course, are the people in charge going to wake up and be able to do something about the difficult situation in which we find ourselves? I certainly hope so, but I have to admit that I am a bit pessimistic about this and about the future of the West if we don't really, once again, wake up. As I said, I do a lot of work in Asia, and I see things moving very fast in Asia, including in China. And for a number of years, we have both in Europe. I used to work also for the European Union, and until just 1 or 2 years ago, the European Union was somehow underestimating the strategic threat presented by China. And so if we don't really, once again, wake up here, I think we're going to be in deep trouble. So I'll stop here, Edmund. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Kokwa, for those sagacious remarks. And now we will would like to welcome Dr. Bernard G. Ramcharan. He is the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he is joining us from France. The floor is yours.
Well, listen, thank you very much for initiating this event, and thank you very much for asking me to join you in some reflections. I've circulated, or I hope you've circulated, a few thoughts that I put down on paper. I just would like to say the following. We all know that these are times of great challenge. I don't need to spell it out to you. The Charter refers to international peace and security. And historically, people have tended to see this word security in conjunction with international peace. But the term international security is a generic term. If you go to the commentary on the Charter of the United Nations, edited by Bruno Simmer, it was published in Germany, they make this point rather forcefully. And now the world is facing a multiplicity of security challenges. Environmental, health in our times, political, economic, social, cultural, humanitarian, human rights. There again, I don't have to spell these out to you. You're quite familiar with them. Then now the question arises, how can the international community best organize itself? How can the international community best educate itself to meet these challenges? Some years ago, I think it was the Brandt Commission that used the concept of cooperative security. I'm not entirely sure if it was the Brandt Commission, but one of these bodies launched a concept rather of cooperative security. I would ask you to think about this term cooperative security for a moment. Because here we are dealing with a world of raw power. We have major powers such as the United States, China, Russia, and we have India, Turkey. Let me add countries like Brazil, Egypt, and I have been before the Security Council in my time. I have written about the Security Council, and I know that it is not an easy thing in having regard to the distribution of power in the world to steer a course for the Security Council. I'm currently reading the new book by General McMaster, the former National Security Advisor to President Trump. Battlegrounds is the title of the book. General McMaster is a soldier, a security expert, and a qualified historian, and he writes rather well. But in the index to this book, it is rather telling that the United Nations does not feature anywhere. And still, there are issues facing humanity as a whole that the superpowers or the major powers really cannot handle solely by themselves. So now, for this discussion, I have recalled a concept first put forward by Secretary General Pérez Acuellar in 1987. And in his report at the time, called Perspectives for the 1990s, he made the case for a comprehensive watch over human security, a comprehensive global watch over human security. And this report at the time was written by a director in his office, a highly respected and thoughtful man named Jim Sutherland. And when Jim, who was one of my mentors, wrote this report, he saw the comprehensive global watch encompassing the areas that I've already mentioned: environmental, health, political, economic, social, cultural, human rights, and humanitarian. Around 1988, when I was the head of the speechwriting service of the Secretary General, I wrote a book called The International Law and Practice of Early Warning and Preventive Diplomacy. And in that book, I mapped out the systems of early warning and alert that existed at the time in areas such as the FAO and the World Food Program, the International Atomic Energy Agency. I don't need to go through these for you. And subsequently, I have written on things like the United Nations and preventive diplomacy for the UN. Cut a long story short, I have followed this issue for a while. And I genuinely believe that Pérez de Cuéllar's concept of a comprehensive watch over human security worldwide is a concept that we need to introduce into the security discussions in our times. Now, I want to say the following. It is possible there exist academic bodies such as the, the Martin Center at Oxford University, and this is what they're dedicated to. There are other academic bodies and there are specialized bodies that perform similar functions. It is possible to imagine a situation in which the UN Secretary General establishes an advisory commission on the comprehensive watch. And this thought is not to be excluded, even if one develops a function for the Security Council. I think it would be useful to have the Security Council enter this picture. And when I thought about it, as I put this in the paper, I could see every 6 months, say, the Security Council inviting in a very friendly, non-confrontational, and cooperative manner a leading expert or experts just to present the data to the Council. And what would this achieve? It would be, as I said, a cooperative approach to security. That's the first point. Secondly, it would contribute to data gathering. Thirdly, it would contribute to promoting public understanding of the issues. Fourthly, it would contribute to policy formation. And fifthly, over a period of time, it might make a contribution to global governance. So to conclude, I want to place before you Pérez de Cuéllar's concept of a comprehensive watch over human security worldwide, a comprehensive global watch. And I want to encourage you to think about how this concept can be made operational. I think it would be fair to say that since Paris-Acquire launched this concept, in the United Nations system, there have not been too many developments. That's the first point. We have things like in the area of the detection of tsunamis, and we have now everybody, I gather that the United Nations issued a report earlier this week advocating that the world should be better prepared to deal with global health threats, to alert and to react. I will end with 2 points. First, I think that since Paris-Acquire launched this concept, it has not been rendered operational. We have piecemeal approaches. That's the first point. And secondly, I think that we have to engage in a global process of ongoing reflections on how the world and humanity can maintain this global watch over human security. I'll stop there, and I'm ready to listen to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. High Commissioner. And now we will turn, keeping in mind those very important remarks, we will turn to the Honorable J. Christopher Giancarlo, the 13th Chairman of the U.S. Commodities Futures Trading Commission, who will address the topic of cryptocurrencies, security, and other related matters.
Thank you, Edmund, and thank you, Professors Koichao and Remcharan. Very interesting remarks. I'm Chris Giancarlo. I'm Senior Counsel at the law firm of Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, and I'm the former Chairman of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the regulator of the world's largest commodity and derivative markets. I'm going to take the conversation in a different direction and talk about the juncture between technology and markets and its impact on global security. And I come at this as a principle in something called the Digital Dollar Project, which I'll talk about, and its role in the future of money. But let me begin with 3 key observations about US financial markets and indeed global financial markets from my 5 years in Washington. And the first point is that much of America's physical infrastructure, its bridges, tunnels, airports, and its mass transit systems that were built in the last century have been allowed to age, deteriorate, and become obsolete in the current one. Professor Koichao talked about neglect. Well, we're certainly talking about neglect, not just in that physical infrastructure, but also in the financial infrastructure in the United States and indeed much of the developed Western economies. Systems for payment and settlement, shareholder and proxy voting, investor access and disclosure, and indeed financial system regulatory oversight that were once state-of-the-art and global models in the 20th century have fallen behind the times and in some cases are embarrassingly so in the 21st century. And this aging financial system infrastructure puts the United States certainly, and I think a lot of the West, at a competitive economic disadvantage to economies like China that are building new financial infrastructure from scratch using new 21st century digital technology. For example, it typically takes days in the US to settle and clear retail bank transfers, but in many other countries it takes minutes, if not seconds. And it also takes days to clear and settle securities transactions and weeks to obtain land title insurance. And nothing reveals the limits of our existing financial system more starkly than the US government's initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in which tens of millions of Americans had to wait a month or more to receive relief payments by paper check. A second observation from my time in government is that these aged financial and regulatory systems are struggling to adapt to the coming wave of digitization, the digitization of things of value. This transformation is what some people call the Internet of Value. Now, the first Internet era, we well know, it was considered the Internet of Information. Wikipedia is an example of that first wave, a massive, decentralized, online reference authority composed collaboratively by volunteers who share knowledge and write peer-reviewed entries without pay. That first internet wave is being superseded by the next wave, the Internet of Things, in which everything from assembly lines to refrigerators will be connected to the internet. Well, that wave will soon be followed by the next wave, one that's perhaps more profound than the earlier ones, and that's the Internet of Value. In this wave, things of value like energy, agricultural and mineral commodities, contracts, stock certificates and land records, property titles, and cultural assets like music, votes and election, even personal identities can be stored, managed, transacted, and moved around in a secure private way from person to person without third-party validators. It will also shift the medium of trust from large centrally managed institutions with legal authority to person-to-person digital handshakes powered by cryptography, tokenization, shared ledgers, and a network of personal computers and smartphones. And nowhere is this Internet of Value going to have a more dramatic impact than in the area of money. Sir John Cunliffe, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, said to me recently that looking at history, it seemed that every several generations, society re-asked the question, what is money? He thinks that this new wave of the internet is causing society to do that again. The birth of Bitcoin in the wake of the 2009 financial crisis was the first iteration of the Internet of Value in the form of a digital asset. And since then, the private sector has launched thousands of budding non-sovereign cryptocurrencies of lesser or greater promise. And those include instruments like Bitcoin that are decentralized and not tied to any national currency, and instruments called stable coins that are also decentralized but offer some degree of price stability by connection to a sovereign currency. And then there are private stable coins built on private blockchains for use by selected issuers, like those being developed for customers at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. And that brings me to my third observation since leaving government. And that's if we act now, we can harness this wave of innovation for greater financial inclusion, capital and operational efficiency, and economic growth around the globe for a generation or more to come. But if we do not act, well, I believe this coming wave of the internet will lay bare the shortcomings of the West's aged, analog, and indeed neglected financial systems. At the start of this year, I launched the Digital Dollar Project at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The Digital Dollar Project is a think tank devoted to the public discussion of the merits of a tokenized form of the United States central bank digital currency, what's called CBDC, and what we call a digital dollar. The project is not a commercial venture. Its mission is entirely one of serving the public interest. It's self-funded, and its partner, Accenture, is providing its services on a pro bono basis. Our mission is to encourage research and public discussion on the advantages of a digital dollar, to convene private sector thought leaders and actors, and propose possible models to support the public sector. Now, when we refer to a US CBDC, we use the phrase digital dollar. We chose that title because it's catchy. However, it's not entirely accurate. The dollar is already digital in the form of electronic bank accounts. But what we're talking about is tokenized fiat money, not accounts-based money. I often explain the difference by pointing out that when one uses Zelle or Venmo, you're still using accounts-based money. The transaction is a series of messages instructing movement by third parties of accounts-based money. When you swipe your phone against a reader for an Apple Pay transaction, it's another series of messages. But with a digital dollar, we're talking about swiping your mobile device and actually moving real money from your device to someone else's device immediately, just like cash, without any messages or intermediaries. Now, today we know we can all share a photo or a video with someone around the world in a nanosecond, but it takes days, if not weeks, to send a few $100s. A digital dollar would make sending money as simple as sending a text message. At the end of 2002, we released our initial white paper, which you can look at digitaldollarproject.org. Well, what I want to do now is talk about why go down this road. Well, speaking broadly, a US digital dollar is ultimately about modernizing core financial system architecture. It's about addressing that issue of neglect. It would offer new functionalities and more refined tools to overcome existing limitations on central bank money. and to bring a number of potential benefits to global payment, clearing, and settlement systems. And we believe it would enhance the dollar's functionality for a digital age. But what about global security, which after all is the purpose of our talk today? Well, there's an enormous amount of work being done currently by overseas central banks around the world on central bank digital currency. And China appears to be particularly advanced in development of a CBDC known as the Digital Currency Electronic Payment System. A number of large, important Chinese businesses are now joining this initiative as partners in testing and implementing the technology. Now, a key purpose of the DCEP is to integrate China's impending digital currency into thousands of DLT applications involving autonomous sensors and 5G telecommunications technology. Its development is designed to provide China with a significant advantage in operating outside of the current Western-dominated bank-centric accounts-based financial system. Imagine, for example, a large African city with a water filtration station in which an electronic sensor developed and provided by China recognizes that its reserves of chlorine are running low. In time, using 5G telecommunications technology, that Chinese-built center will instruct a computer to automatically order chlorine supplies from a Chinese supplier in turn for a direct digital RMB payment with little to no human management and no interaction with the global account-based bank system. Undoubtedly, creating direct information and money transfer mechanisms that avoid transaction intermediaries will bring efficiency gains to smart cities, supply chains, and electricity grids. At the same time, working around the Western-dominated traditional banking system will undoubtedly help China's independent economic expansion. In time, China is likely to integrate DCEP into its expanding Belt Road Initiative by encouraging participating economies to direct peer-to-peer payments using digital RMB. Or it could lure developing economies throughout Southeast Asia and Africa to peg their digital domestic currencies to that of China. Chinese technological dominance in deploying digital currency systems that serve the coming Internet of Value certainly pose challenges for the US and other democratic societies. If payment systems can bypass the global account-based banking system, the West will lose a powerful policy tool of economic sanctions. The stakes for this contest of the future of digital money are as high as any transformational technological revolutions that we've known. On the outcome lies the future of money and the values that will be enshrined in it. You know, the past few generations of the dollar's global ascendance was accompanied by a historical rarity, the birth of a truly world market for global goods and services. And that birth led to the emergence into the middle class of hundreds of millions of historically impoverished people. It's not a coincidence, but a consequence, I believe, of the ascendancy of the US dollar as a global reserve currency and the values associated with it, that today more people than ever before in recorded human history enjoy improved health, child welfare, educational and civil liberty attributes that accompany material wherewithal. This remarkable flowering of human well-being has something to do with the global flowering of democratic ideals of individual liberty, free enterprise, personal privacy, limited government, and the rule of law, which I frequently cited during my time in public service. These ideals are enshrined in the US currency, the dollar. Coding those ideals of economic freedom and balanced privacy into a digital dollar will surely enhance its global appeal. Hundreds of millions of people in the developing world may well be reluctant to surrender their growing economic security and autonomy to authoritarian state surveillance, simply for the convenience of digital payments. And I believe, as it has so often in its history, the US has the opportunity to lead in a way that's consistent with its finest ideals. The launch of a US CBDC is a logical and critical next step to increase financial inclusion, enshrine democratic values in the future of money, drive societal and economic benefits, and future-proof the US dollar for generations to come. And that's why we believe the time has come to explore a digital dollar. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Giancarlo, for those extremely insightful, extremely important remarks. We will now turn to Professor Uchenna Ekwo, who will talk to us about peace journalism. Dr. Ekwo is a faculty at the City University of New York and is the president of the Center for Media and Peace Initiatives.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sure. Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's been a privilege to join you guys. I've listened from the beginning and a very interesting conversation. So I would like to take it to a different realm, to just have a conversation with the group on issues related to peace journalism, and I'll try to make a connection to how it's also directly related to international peace and security. One of the speakers also tried to bifurcate peace and security, but I also look at communications on how it can also have some strategic value and also pose some security challenges as well. As all of us may know, never before in human history has more information been made available to more people. And at the same time also, never before in human history has more bad information been made available to more people. You know, we live in an era of information revolution, but at the same time, this information abundance also do have its consequences. And we live in at a time when, even with this information abundance, many citizens are grossly ill-informed, uninformed, or misinformed. As a matter of fact, a recent study by Cornell University that studied about 38 million articles around the world on the drivers of, I don't know, many of you may have seen the report on the drivers of misinformation during this COVID-19. It's terrible. And you discovered that mostly political leaders are at the forefront of this misinformation campaign going on. And the sad thing is that some of this misinformation that go around the world do have consequences for lives. A couple of people may have died for lack of information. And like Ujari say in information is the lifeblood of democracy. And a properly informed citizenry will ensure better democratic participation of the people. And if, for example, political leaders are drivers of misinformation, then it really portends danger and a major security threat to mutual coexistence of different countries, or even within countries as well. So the issue of what we now call infodemic, or a reference to the spread of misinformation at a time when the world faces the greatest public health care challenge. People are dying and people will still die, and the worst thing to happen is for people to die out of ignorance. So having said that, I will want to take a look at a few issues in journalism, especially the fixation of journalism to oddities and things that are unusual and all that, and perhaps make a suggestion for a complete reconstruction of journalism. So when you look at journalism as a profession itself, as you go through the process of learning, going through the studies of becoming a journalist and all that, one central thing that you find very common is that usually we teach students that when a dog bites a man, it's no news. But when a man bites a dog, that is news. And for example, when it bleeds, it leads. In other words, there seems not to be a conscious effort actually to look at positive things or even to emphasize solutions. So it's around that concept that even researchers began to think about things such as peace journalism, to emphasize what are the choices editors and reporters make, and how do they make those decisions, and how does such decisions, how would such decisions help citizens to embrace nonviolent responses to conflict? So this is the whole concept of peace journalism, or perhaps what some other people call solution journalism. For example, we live in this era of misinformation, but yet we still find some news organizations perpetrate or even make these misinformation even more palpable and more and spreading this information more across different areas, different belief systems and all that. And like someone mentioned earlier on, we are facing a challenge about this healthcare, this public health issue. Now, wearing a mask, in my own opinion, does not cost you anything if you can save your life. But the thing has been framed in such a way that some segment of the population will see wearing masks as something evil or something that deprives people of their freedom. And some news organizations are championing such cause. And on the other side of the divide, I think we're encouraging people to wear masks. And sometimes, even when some political leaders will make some incendiary remarks, we chime on it and blow it out of proportion, or sometimes failing to ignore such things. So in that way, we are also exacerbating this problem and creating more infodemic at a time when people will really need to get information that will help them to make informed choices about how to live their lives. So that is why I've also said, if some of you may be familiar with that, I don't know whether any of you have seen anyone or any newsroom where you find a peace correspondent, but most of the time journalists will always want to show off to say they're covering wars. I'm a war correspondent. I remember Brian Williams got in trouble when Brian Williams of NBC got in trouble when he tried to lie and say that he flew in a helicopter or whatever during the Iraq War or whatever. And that's just that fixation towards violence. So most times the extent to which journalists encourage a policy of violence definitely makes the realization of peace and even security more difficult. So at every point in time, reporters owe it a duty to the audience to understand, or rather not to be part of a conflict, rather. A reporter should not be a part of conflict itself. So instead of helping to create more panic, you don't want to get involved in the conflict itself. There's a particular reporter I remember somewhere in Kenya, sometime in 2007, who got into trouble. Actually, he was brought to the war crimes tribunal over his role during the post-election violence in Kenya. He was working in a radio station, and he was really fanning the embers of discord and caused a lot of people to lose their lives. So in one way or the other, like today, we may not be in real war or like the war we had, like the Second World War or First War, but there seems to be war in peacetime in the way we gather information, the way we curate information, and the way we share information through different media organizations. And even the concept of fake news is gaining traction more than even real news itself. As a matter of fact, there are studies that indicate that there are more clicks of fake news than even real news. So now brings to question even the role of the audience itself all of us. So we seem to be fixated or interested in fairy tales or some oddities of behaviors of some people either in public life or whatever, compared to encouraging or embracing the ideal behavior that we expect of a public office holder. So in essence, the news media itself is helping to create this insecurity that do exist. Even the way we report conflicts in major flashpoints around the world should also reflect our embrace to understand the context of conflicts and present some options rather than just framing public debates over conflict issues in such a way that we seem to be on the side of violent responses to conflict. Today, two political parties are having challenges about the election. There is little effort to look at someone in the middle and their opinion on how to bring people together. All we do is we continue to engage in separate contestations about a Republican Party said this, Democratic Party said this. But obviously there are some people who are concerned about the polarization in the system, but those people are really giving voices, to reflect issues that will be of interest and long-term interest for the entire country. And of course, and this is not just in the United States, all over the world. As someone has said earlier on, we live in an era of polarization. There is so much populism, and it looks, unfortunately, even some young people even seem to be encouraging such populist tendencies around the world. And I think it poses a great challenge to international peace and security. And to the extent to which the news media can play a role in getting involved in mediating rather than agitating, that will do a great service to humanity. And will, of course, be part of, like one speaker talked about, global watch over human security. So I think as Watchdog Society, journalists should really, really think about how they can become actors in the development it covers, policy media interaction model and stuff like that, instead of just being fixated in drama of conflicts, rather than dream of peace. So I think I'll probably stop here for us to continue the conversation. I would like to take more questions. I just wanted to make it as much conversation as possible, and I didn't want to talk about the challenges also posed by the internet in terms of how it's also another way we fuel discontent and fuel misinformation and disinformation. And the difference between misinformation and disinformation in terms of deliberate intention to misinform or to deceive a person or a group of persons versus when you just make ordinary mistakes, which you can also retract and make corrections. So I yield at this point.
Professor Echo, thank you for those remarks. And we will now turn to the senior speaker of the Polish Parliament.
It is a pleasure as the senior speaker of the Polish Parliament to address the 2020 International Security Forum Summit. I wish we could be meeting in person as we have done in past years, but I'm pleased to deliver this presentation virtually. As many of you know, on April 10, 2010, the Tupolev Tu-154 aircraft carrying the Polish president and first lady together with the military, political, and social elite of Poland was destroyed over Russian territory by an explosion near the Smolensk North Airport. The Polish delegation was en route to Katyn when in April 1940, the Soviets murdered thousands of Polish officers and intelligentsia, shot in the back of the head. As a result of this explosion, 96 people perished, all the passengers and crew. Specifically, killed were President Lech Kaczynski with his wife Maria, the last president in exile, Ryszard Kaczorowski, all commanders of the Polish armed forces, including the Chief of General Staff, General Franciszek Gongor, Chief Military Chaplains, Deputy Speakers of the Parliament, the Senate, ministers, members of Parliament, the Human Rights Ombudsman, the President of the Institute of National Remembrance, and social activists, among them Anna Walentynowicz, the founder of Solidarity, the trade union that brought down the Iron Curtain. In one moment, Poland was deprived of political leadership, military and security command, and important moral and social authorities. As the National Assembly later described, it was the greatest tragedy to hit Poland since 1945. This tragedy happened at a special moment. Half a year earlier, and the day preceding the celebration of the outbreak of World War II, the then Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, published in the Polish press letter to the Poles, in which he stated that the political system in Europe should be reconstructed and based on a Russian-German alliance that would allow the formation of Great Europe. Putin also shifted responsibility for the Second World War to the West and justified the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. This reference to the language of Nazi Germany and the Russian-German imperial concept was in no way weakened by the fact that Putin offered Poland participation in such an agreement. President Kaczynski's answer was immediate and unequivocal. Poland will never support the aspirations of imperial powers to do not respect the sovereignty of other states, human rights, and the principles of democracy. It was a direct reference to the Russian aggression against Georgia in 2008 and the occupation of a quarter of the territories of the country's territory, as well as to the systematic refusal by Putin's Russia to admit its complicity with Germany in unleashing the Second World War and the division of Europe, as well as the occupation of these nations by the Soviet Union until 1989. President Kaczynski's position was in line with the political agenda pursued by the Law and Justice government, which in 2005 and 2007 aimed at concluding a strategic alliance with the United States and at building a lasting agreement between Central European countries in order to create a security system against Russian aggression and to guarantee energy independence. Therefore, Poland made efforts to admit Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. Such a proposal was discussed by President Kaczynski and President Bush during the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, but was rejected by Angela Merkel with the support of France. This role of the strongest countries in dominating the European Union was continuation of their position already indicated in 2002. In the war on terror, this status had together demonstratively shown with the Russian Federation a rejection of United States action in Iraq. From that moment on, the From that moment on, the division of European countries emerged. On the one hand, there are those who want to build a kind of federal structure on the basis of the European Union, moving further and further away from the alliance with the United States and the transatlantic agreement. The geopolitical perspective of these countries is a continental alliance that creates a common geopolitical, economic, and in the future military collaboration with Russia and China. This concept of the European army is impractical, as it would not be able to defend itself against military domination by the Russian Federation, especially its nuclear forces. This flawed idea is included in the European Union's program of EU strategic autonomy. It is also the source of the systematic rejection of the commitments made in the 2014 Wales summit to allocate at least 2% of GDP on defense spending. Hence, the opposition of Germany and France toward the admission of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO, and in the following years, the lack of determination to stop the Russian aggression against Georgia and Ukraine, and then to the attacks with chemical weapons on British citizens and the leaders of the Russian opposition. Especially shocking was the lack of repose to the downing the MH17 over Ukraine with 300 Dutch citizens aboard. A symbolic but also key role in this policy is played by consent to the construction of the Russian-German Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which creates permanent strategic ties between Russia and Germany in the energy sphere, and thus is fundamental for the economic future of both countries. Nord Stream 2, rightly called the new Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is building the base of the common space of continental alliance, striving to permanently eliminate the United States not only from Europe, but also from Eurasia. It risks pushing the United States to the margins of world politics. On the other hand, we have Central European countries from the Baltic to Balkans, which are looking for assistance in mutual alliance with support from the United States. It is not a coincidence that these are the countries that, despite economic difficulties, strengthen their own military forces, spending at least 2% of GDP, that is, fulfilling the commitment that the richest countries in Europe have for the past 70 years benefited from, owing to American military guarantees of the troops stationed there, but have not paid their agreed share. Poland plays the most important role not only because of its size, population, and military potential, but also above all because of its geopolitical location separating Russia from Germany and Western Europe, and thus preventing the construction of Great Europe under the dictation of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, the political changes in the United States and Western Europe in 2007 and 2009 opened the way to Russian aggression. The American openness to Russia's demands, Germany starting the construction of Nord Stream 2, France accelerating with Germany the construction of Federal European Union, the announcement EU autonomy in military and strategic matters, and the government of Donald Tusk deciding to tighten economic and political ties with the Russian Federation, all portended disaster. Such concepts would produce a permanent dependence of Poland on Russian gas supplies and the opening of borders to the free movement of Russian citizens to the European Union. According to the accounts of a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Radoslaw Sikorski, in 2008, Vladimir Putin offered Donald Tusk to participate in partition of Ukraine, which he did not refuse. No wonder then that in 2009, Putin made a public offer to reconstruct Europe in alliance with Germany, being sure that Poland would accept this proposal. The stance of President Kaczynski and the Polish independence movement came as a shock to Russia and was considered an obstacle that must be overcome at all costs. After the death of President Kaczynski and the Polish national elite in the Smolensk catastrophe, there was a sharp turn in Polish politics and the fundamental weakening of allied tendencies in Central Europe. The death of President Kaczynski was used by the previous administration as a symbol of Polish-Russian friendship and an opening to a historic agreement. An energy treaty was signed, which made Poland dependent on Russia for 20 years, and the integration with the European Union was accelerated, at the same time exacerbating the dismantling of the Polish army. President Kaczynski and the Air Force commander and Polish pilots were blamed for the Smolensk catastrophe, and the investigation of the crash was handed over to Prime Minister Putin, the chairman of the Russian Commission. Polish representatives were prevented from accessing evidence, including the original black boxes, airfield examination of the wreckage, and the bodies of the deceased. The falsification of these materials, including the presence of explosives on the wreckage and the remains of the bodies of the fallen, played an important role. This is achieved, among other matters, to this day by the refusal to return to Poland its property, including the remains of the wreckage and navigation devices. The Russian side and they accusing Poland of causing the catastrophe and disqualifying the actual research into its causes. These activities were approved by some European countries. The situation began to change only after the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the occupation of Crimea and Donbas. There, Polish people, especially the younger generation, realized that Poland poorly governed and helpless towards Russian aggression. Slowly, they tried to organize paramilitary organizations to assist the Polish armed forces in sustaining independence. There have been fundamental political changes in the United States and Poland. The election of President Andrzej Duda and the law and justice government in Poland, as well as President Trump and the Republicans in the United States, resulted in a return to the policy of the strategic alliance of Eastern and Central Europe with the United States, based on the involvement of Poland and the presence of NATO and United States troops. The groundbreaking NATO summit in Warsaw took place in Poland in 2016, organized by me as the Minister of National Defense. I was proud to initiate the establishment of the territorial defense forces, reform the armed forces and the strategic alliance with the United States, spearhead the permanent presence of United States and NATO troops in Poland and across Central Europe, increase Polish defense expenditures to 2.5% of GDP and facilitate to the purchase of Patriot and HIMARS from the United States. A new commission investigating the Smolensk tragedy was also established under the auspices of the Ministry of National Defense. The commission, working closely with United States governmental and research institutions, including the National Institute for Aviation Research at Wichita State University, the University of Akron in Ohio, and the University of Oregon's Explosives Laboratory, in its final report concluded that the cause of the crash was false instructions by Russian air traffic controllers and ultimately an explosion in the left wing and in the center wing caused by the identified explosive, hexogen, pentrite, and TNT. The results of the research were presented to the National Defense Committee of the Parliament of Poland on July of this year. Earlier, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe reacted unequivocally to the Polish results of the Smolensk tragedy. It recalled the fact that the plane was destroyed by an explosion and demanded the immediate return of the wreckage, comparing the behavior of the Russian Federation to the actions of the Soviets in the case of the Katyn massacre. I hope that the death of the Polish president and the national elite in the Smolensk attack will finally make our allies aware of the real scale of threats to the security of Europe and the world from the rulers of the Russian Federation. Thank you.
So we thank the senior speaker for his remarks, and we now will proceed to Seth Sheldon, who will talk to us about nuclear weapons policy and the Nobel Prize-winning organization he's involved with on this in this realm.
Hi, thank you, Edmund. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, thank you for bringing us together and this very impressive panel. I really appreciated listening. I hope I can keep you engaged as I've been about a slightly different topic, but clearly related. I actually know that I only confirmed joining a few hours ago, and I find that when I don't prepare remarks, I end up speaking longer. So Edmund, please feel free to give me a signal if you need us to wrap up, and I will. But as an introduction, yes, my name is Seth Sheldon, and my background is as a lawyer and a law professor, but I work for as the UN liaison for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And listening to everyone speak and thinking about the theme today, well, the theme of this event, global security and geostrategy, emergent perspectives and challenges. So I was thinking I might reverse the order, talk about challenges first. As Dr. Ramcharan said, many of us are aware, and some of it we need not go through the dire situation that we are in with respect to so many global security challenges. But I'll talk maybe a bit about what's at stake, because I think we don't always think about it enough with respect to nuclear weapons. Certainly those of us who aren't working with it closely, and even those that have been working with a specific framework that I think needs to be rethought. And then I will talk about how we are rethinking it in terms of emerging perspectives and the meaningful hope that I think is offered by the new Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which many of you may not be aware of. But I hope you'll, even if you are, you'll see our work and our treaty in a new light today. So yeah, you know, I think in the previous presentations, we were hearing a lot about challenges, right? And the challenges of multilateral cooperation are so apparent right now with countries withdrawing from treaties, and with respect to nuclear weapons, this withdrawal frightens a lot of people, and rightly so. We've seen a real step back in leadership from those countries that hold the majority of these weapons. When we talk about the US and Russia that have 91% of, we think, of nuclear weapon arsenals in the world, we should all be paying close attention to the way they have been acting with respect to their obligations to pursue disarmament. And you know, the demise of the INF Treaty holds particular concern for Europeans. I suppose a lot of this audience might be in Poland. So, you know, the US and Russia now abandoning a long time moratorium on the kinds of missile delivery systems that are in ranges that could strike anywhere on the continent should be concerning. And, you know, we're now seeing strained relations among these so-called superpowers, and clawing back of other treaties that have been fundamental to the détente that we've had for a while. And, you know, most notably, we're all paying attention to what's going to happen to New START now, and to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has its upcoming review conference that's been delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. But, you know, when we think about the way we have thought about it in the past, this deterrence-based model, that it seems to have made sense to at least a lot of leaders, but not all, and a little bit more about that soon, but that we've been operating under for so long, you know, we've been sleepwalking into a system that doesn't look like that model in any way anymore, and we haven't properly adjusted. And I think Dr. Ramcharan, in talking about cooperative security, I think sets up kind of well what we've been hoping to do. You know, we have more actors that possess nuclear weapons than ever, and even though there are fewer nuclear weapons in the world than there were during the height of the Cold War, they're more powerful than ever, and now we're seeing increased conflicts in between provocations between nuclear powers, nuclear armed states, India and Pakistan, literally threatening each other with nuclear war over the past year. Similar sentiments exchanged between North Korean and US leaders, conflicts in the South China Sea. We have concerns that we've never faced, that old models will never solve. You know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, this is the organization that maintains this metaphorical doomsday clock, telling us how close we are to Armageddon. They have told us that the risk of nuclear apocalypse right now is higher than it has been ever. 100 seconds to midnight in their clock. UNIDIR, the UN Institute on Disarmament Research, has generally concurred. You know, since the end of the Cold War, we've decided, a lot of people decided that the likelihood of use of nuclear weapons has abated, has, you know, decreased, and is a faraway concern. But the experts tell us that's not true, and I hope that the experts here, you know, especially given how much influence and leadership that we have, you know, represented here, we'll see that and appreciate the danger and think about in new light the solution that we have. I think, you know, the deterrence fallacy, the one that has us believe that, you know, it's a good idea to keep maintaining these arsenals, you know, the dangers of maintaining that thinking is really difficult to overestimate, especially as the so-called balances become increasingly imbalanced. You know, over the years too, we've seen that we've come a lot closer to the brink than we thought we did. Even that is clearly something that didn't even work in its time. It's not that we avoided nuclear war because nuclear weapons exist. We avoided nuclear war despite nuclear weapons existing, and thank goodness that we've had a multitude of factors that have kept us safe in that sense so far. but not all of us, if I should note. You know, I think it's very important to sort of recognize that you know, the possession of nuclear weapons has not prevented use. Sure, not in Europe, but we have seen them used in testing in so many communities that have been harmed by the environmental impact and continuing multi-generational effects on victims in other states, and many in the Southern Hemisphere, in Algeria or the Pacific Islands, but also Kazakhstan by the Russians. And now we are talking about testing again, you know, and I think as you know, this is, as I say, very concerning. I think just to take one, you know, when you think about climate, for instance, we talk a lot about how the climate crisis looms in a manner that could dwarf the effects of what we're seeing now with the COVID-19 crisis. You know, I think that's true. I think that, you know, I hope that at least, as many people have said, I think as Dr. Ramcharan was saying too, that this should lead us to contemplate a big change in how we think about security. That's one thing we could get out of this, and how we have to be more cooperative. You know, I think we need to quickly dispose of the deterrence model as the solution. You know, even if you don't agree, as we believe that, you know, that it's not nuclear weapons that have prevented war, because they haven't. But that's a really difficult argument to unpack and requires, you know, proving a negative, which no scientist could do. But that's not really the appropriate question to ask even. The question should not be whether nuclear weapons deter ever, but really should be, will nuclear weapons deter forever? And I think we can all agree that we're talking about luck-based security, as we call it, and that's not going to last to the extent it has, in that, you know, indefinitely. Maintaining these arsenals, now rebuilding these arsenals, this is not a solution. We're going to, you know, sleepwalk into a disaster that will dwarf the consequences of COVID-19 and also potentially climate. Well, I don't think it's worth saying which is worse, the climate disaster or nuclear weapons, but I think we can think about them in the ways that they're interconnected, in ways that maybe not all of us have appreciated. You know, I think of, well, many of us think of climate disruption and nuclear weapons as humanity's twin existential threats. They both threaten humanity, but in a way they mutually enforce each other in a cycle of doom. You know, the climate crisis will lead to food and resource insecurity, and insecurity in resources leads to humanitarian disasters and refugee crises and you know, economic struggles. And these crises increase risk of conflict, and increased risk of conflict increases the risk of use of the worst weapons we have. And these are mutually reinforcing cycles that, you know, I think it's very clear to say, it's not an overstatement to say that they could spell the end of humanity. You know, I think that the effects of this kind of conflict loom far away from even the place where nuclear weapons are used. I mean, when we look at the weapons that have been were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and in those attacks, the weapons that are in the arsenals now make those look like, you know, ancient weaponry. They're much, much bigger. And when scientists established the concept decades ago of nuclear winter, you know, they were thinking about the possibility of risks to the climate that are that extend throughout the world, that, you know, that cause global temperature changes, and from the results of the atmospheric debris that block out the sun, and will have consequences in places far away from the conflict. So all this just to say, you know, these are what we think of nuclear weapons as the most acute risk to the climate, in that, you know, not in climate change is generally on a longer time scale, but nuclear weapons can exacerbate these problems, instantaneously. They're both within humanity's making, both within our power to ameliorate, and they both require urgent action. And anyone who's concerned about one, I think, should be concerned about the other. But okay, let me tell you what we're doing about it. I'll tell you a bit about ICAN and what we've put forth as a solution. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, that's our logo. We're a global coalition. We're around 550 partners of NGOs in about 105 countries, all committed to pursuing as a solution to these problems a ban, a prohibition on nuclear weapons. We were launched in 2007. And we've sought to reframe the discussion from one that's focused on state security interests to one focused on human security interests. And this, we call it the humanitarian shift in the disarmament world. And it's meant to recognize that when it comes to these kind of threats, borders are meaningless and we're all at risk and we need to work together. And everyone has a voice. There are victims who are potential victims and actual victims who are not citizens of the places of those countries that have these weapons and that think that they get to dictate the policy without input from others. And in doing this, we get to put at the front of the conversation, as we have done, where it's traditionally been all political strategists and military strategists and industry leaders, military industrial complex leadership. Now we can advance testimony from scientists and doctors, survivors, to help us say and establish that we're not able to provide any adequate humanitarian response in the event of any use of nuclear weapons. The dangers of nuclear weapons extend beyond the borders of where they're used, and we therefore need a global norm for abolition that leads to elimination. So this sort of thinking has had a long history in peacemaking, but we owe a lot to the inspiration of similar initiatives like the International Campaign to Ban Landmines that led to what's happened in the next decade or so since our founding in 2007. There were a series of conferences in 2013 and 2014 around the world that led to basically a pledge signed by 127 countries that declared that any use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic humanitarian consequences. Doesn't seem like that's so hard to say, but that's what it took. And for all of these countries to agree that no effective humanitarian response would be possible, and that the only solution would be to build a prohibition and to get to it. And so with that, we in 2016 were able to adopt at the UN General Assembly a vote to move forward with a conference to begin negotiations. 2017 happens, we negotiate this treaty. By July, we have the final document. That's this I carry around. The document is it's a comprehensive, it's a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It's comprehensively and categorically prohibits all activities relating to nuclear weapons, use, threat of use, development, production, manufacture, testing, anything in the life cycle of a nuclear weapon, basically. Also has other provisions around assisting others to do any of the prohibited acts. It's contemplated as a document and as a treaty that will complement and reinforce the commitments of parties under all of the existing non-proliferation and disarmament structures, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, especially the Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is an obligation to pursue effective measures on disarmament. So all states in the NPT, which is almost all countries in the world, have that obligation. And so they see the supporters of the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, see that as implementing that obligation. Treaty also has what we call positive obligations. They require states, parties to take steps to remediate environments and to assist victims of nuclear weapons use and testing. Okay, and then skipping a little bit forward, on July 7th, 2017, the treaty was adopted by a UN vote of 122 states in favor to 1 against. And it's gotten more support ever since. Not support, just, I'm sure this is on your mind, but we've been opposed by the nuclear armed states and the umbrella states, their allies, which includes the NATO states and Poland, of course. But currently 140 or so states have indicated their support for the treaty. A couple of months later, September 2017, the treaty opens for signature. October 2017, ICANN was selected for the Nobel Peace Prize. In December, we went to Norway to accept the award. Here it is, by the way. I promised Edmund that I would show it. This is the Nobel Peace Prize. It was awarded to ICANN for our work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and what the Nobel Committee characterized as our groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of those weapons. Since then, our work has been all about this treaty bringing into force. That will happen when 50 states ratify or otherwise accede to the treaty. So we are actually at a very exciting moment that I can talk about real quick is that 84 states have signed the treaty. That's a ratification, accession, that usually requires a parliamentary process, takes a bit longer. As I said, we will enter into force when 50 states have ratified. As of this week, just the other day, we hit our 47th ratification. That means we're now 3 ratifications away from reaching that requisite 50 to bring about entry into force, and it will clearly happen very soon. I can't publicly talk about who or when exactly, but it will be soon. This is what the UN was essentially formed to do. The very first resolution of the UN, we're currently celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, right? Next week's the anniversary of the UN Charter's entry into force. In January, we're going to see the 75th anniversary of the very first resolution. That resolution, 1940s, that was 1946 at the point, but was to eliminate atomic weapons from national armaments. That was like, it was co-sponsored by every member state of the UN. So, even we think that this is something that anyone who believes in the mission of multilateralism and disarmament should be celebrating this milestone. And, and of course, not everyone is, but we think that that will come around. I think that I really appreciated what Dr. Akwo was saying about the challenge of presenting solutions in journalism and media and the concept of peace journalism. And we've seen it with this treaty. People are so quick to tell us what we cannot do, even as we're doing it. I'm a cynic at heart. I understand the perspective of cynicism and pointing out what the flaws of a strategy are. But in this journey, that's the narrative that dominates in the media, and and there's a very powerful system that is poised to say that this should not be the solution. And experts at every so telling us that we wouldn't do what we did. They don't shift after it's proven that we've done it. They talk about more what we can't do, that we're oversimplifying the issues. We can't impose disarmament in an environment where state security doesn't allow it, that we undermine the existing security regime, which is particularly absurd, I think. But, I think that what we do see is in growing support, even among those that formally were dragging their feet. And the Secretary General of the UN and has just added, more and more important voices come on. I think people who think that you can't ban nuclear weapons kind of need to get out of the way, those who are making it happen. But we're not there yet, of course. We're still building towards entry into force. It will happen soon. What does it even mean? I mean, of course, it will not apply to non-states parties in a legal sense at the start. But this is about there's so much promise for where we're going. At a minimum, this is very clearly a powerful statement of expectations from the vast majority of the world, saying that nuclear armed states need to stop relying on them, must take serious steps toward its elimination. But at a maximum, we're talking about the instrument that could provide, and there's no reason that it couldn't, it's just a political issue at the moment, a framework for global nuclear disarmament. And it's groundbreaking, and it needs to get more, I think, positive attention for that. When the treaty enters into force, we can be confident that no nuclear weapon state will be there at the outset. But for starters, the states that have joined the treaty, they're going to have to maintain, they're going to have to provide requisite declarations about their nuclear weapon status. We're going to have a first meeting of states parties within a year of entry into force. They are required to maintain IAEA safeguards agreements that they now have into force. They have to, at a minimum, bring into force a comprehensive safeguards agreement. There's all these requirements that are not even in existing, explicit in existing nuclear weapons infrastructure that, the treaty will help to enforce and supplement in a supportive way the existing non-proliferation and other nuclear weapons treaties. I think I'm getting a little bit. If I said, I'll just let's see. I mean, what about the states that haven't joined? Such as Poland and the NATO. Several EU states have joined, and of course, the effort is being led by states like Austria and Ireland. We think that this is a long-term solution, and I mean, we're seeing immediate effects right away, but in terms of a norm that's going to be strengthened by the TPNW's entry into force, we see how it's worked with other disarmament treaties, including, on landmines and cluster munitions, that lead to changes in behavior, even from non-state parties, from those states that oppose it. But in the meantime, we're seeing that we have so much support in NATO states and nuclear armed states from Poles. We have projects such as the Cities Appeal, where hundreds of cities around the world have adopted local legislation in support of the TPNW. After all, nuclear weapons are targeted at cities, and it makes most sense for them to be the innocent civilians who are targeted to have a say. We have the Parliamentary Pledge, where parliamentarians in nuclear umbrella states designate their support for the treaty. We've seen prominent former leaders getting into this as well. I mean, last month, there was a very widely publicized open letter from over 50 high-ranking officials from NATO states. A lot of military and ex-leaders who calling on their government to join the TPNW from NATO states. And they said, we must not. Where is that language? It was, we must not sleepwalk into a crisis of even greater proportions than the one we have experienced this year, referring to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it was either Professor Kochel or maybe Dr. Ramcharan who spoke about short-sightedness of leadership today and the need to think about longer-term solutions. And I agree with that. I think that, as has been the case with other treaties, we're going to see this norm universalize and grow, and even those who said it was impossible will come on board. I think we hope that this will help people envision a different model and will reflect on how we've often said things were impossible. I mean, imagine living in the middle of slavery, which lasted tens of thousands of years, and having someone walk up and say, I think we should, abolish this. And now it's a widely accepted norm that's abhorrent. I think we should try to all work together to get to the same perspective before nuclear weapons are used, because by that time it well may be too late. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth. And with that, I would like to thank, on behalf of the International Security Forum, all of our distinguished speakers today. And we look forward to future events and hosting these individuals these very prominent persons, as well as our other prominent people involved with the International Security Forum. And we also would like to encourage everyone to join us at the Dershowitz Conference, which is coming up in the following month. So with that, we'll let us conclude. Thank you once again on behalf of the International Security Forum. Thank you.